Madam President, this week we're debating the National Defense Authorization Act of 2017. Very important. Members of both sides have contributed to this very important legislation that we pass every year. Funds our military, authorizes spending, training. It's really one of the most important things we do here in the United States Senate. Like many others, I want to thank the members of the Armed Services Committee. I have the privilege of serving on that committee. Chairman McCain, Ranking Member Reed, for all the hard work that they've put into this, and all the members of the committee, and how seriously we take this responsibility. And you've heard the discussions. This bill is needed now more than ever. We are seeing accidents in terms of training that are killing the lives of young men and women serving in the military, and a lot of it is due to readiness. In fact, Madam President, the past 8 years, the U.S. military has seen its budget decline by almost 25%. A huge decrease when we know, just pick up the paper, see what's going on in the world, when we know that the national security threats to the United States have dramatically increased. So decreasing budgets, increasing national security challenges, and this NDAA begins the much-needed process of changing that. I'd like to focus on one such threat that we need to address right now. It's at the doorstep of our great nation. And what the NDAA is doing about that, specifically, that threat. The threat is North Korea's nuclear intercontinental ballistic activity and capability. And Madam President, as you know, that has now become a threat to literally every city in the United States. Not just frontline states like mine, the great state of Alaska, or Hawaii, that are closer to Asia than any other place in the United States. This threat is now on the doorstep of every American city. Now, for years, a lot of the quote-unquote experts and intel officials were saying, hey, don't worry about this. They're trying, but this threat is a long way off into the future. Some of us were skeptical of those estimates, and now we know those estimates were wrong. It is no longer a matter of if, but when the North Korean regime will have the capability to launch an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile aimed at the United States of America. There was a disturbing article recently in the Washington Post, the lead paragraph of which stated, quote, North Korea will be able to field a reliable, nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile as early as next year. U.S. officials have concluded in a confidential assessment that this will dramatically shrink the timeline for when North Korea could strike North American cities with atomic weapons. So this new assessment was leaked by someone within the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency, and it shaves almost 2 full years off what we thought North Korea's capability was. So right now, the threat's here. And think about this threat with regard to who's leading North Korea. An unstable dictator who has shown that he's not rational. Madam President, let me go into a little bit more of the threat here. When you look at the different regimes, Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un, the current dictator of North Korea, in just 5 years since he's come to power, he's conducted more missile tests, more than 80, and over twice as many nuclear tests as both his father and grandfather did in their 60 years of ruling North Korea. Look at this chart. It shows missile tests, nuclear tests. 5 years. Way more than his father and grandfather ever did. And while several of these missile tests have been failures, we've obviously seen clear successes. In fact, while many Americans were celebrating the July 4th holiday, our patriotism, our liberty, our military, Kim Jong-un launched a successful test of an intercontinental ballistic missile. And on the nuclear side, we've seen activity even more recently. Allegedly a test of a hydrogen bomb with an estimated yield of 120 kilotons. Their third nuclear test since January 2016. It was 8 times more powerful than their last test. Bottom line with regard to this threat, in a very unstable regime, they are making very significant progress. So that's the threat. Very real, on our shores, led by an unstable dictator who has threatened to use these weapons. So what are we doing about it? Well, we have the capability to defend against this threat. And that capability is through much more enhanced missile defense for the homeland of the United States, for our cities. And that's what this National Defense Authorization Act does. Now, unfortunately, Madam President, over the past several years, the federal government has not taken homeland missile defense very seriously. One study recently found that in its history, our homeland missile defense has been characterized by, quote, a trend of high ambition, followed by increasing modesty. The high ambition has been largely driven by the threats to our nation. But the decreasing the modesty component has been largely a function of decreasing budgets for the Missile Defense Agency. In fact, from 2006 to 2016, the Missile Defense Agency's budget has declined nearly 25%. Homeland missile defense testing has declined by nearly 83%. So when our adversaries are testing and advancing, we've been going in the opposite direction. But Madam President, I'm glad to say that this year's National Defense Agency, NDAA, reverses this long-term trend of homeland missile defense neglect. Earlier this year, with a number of my colleagues in this body, we introduced the Advancing America's Missile Defense Act of 2017. Now, this was a bill that we worked on for months with the experts in missile defense, the military experts, the civilian experts, to say, what do we need to better protect the United States of America? What are the key elements? We put this together in a bill that we introduced several months ago, focusing on the following key areas. First, the Advancing America's Missile Defense Act would dramatically increase our capacity, what are called our ground-based missile interceptors, up to 28 more interceptors, and require our military to look at fielding 100 more, up to 100 missile interceptors to fully protect the United States. Second, our bill would advance the technology to not only have more ground-based missile interceptors, but the kill vehicles on top of those missiles, the bullets from which the missiles can shoot additional warheads. This is technology that's advancing, but it needs to advance much more quickly. Third, our bill looks at integrating the different missile defense systems throughout the world. So in theater, for example, in South Korea, we have the THAAD system, and we have that on Guam. We have Aegis systems with our Navy ships. And then we have our ground-based system back home in the homeland of the United States. Our bill looks at integrating these systems with a space-based sensor to have an unblinking eye in terms of the technology that can track and shoot down missiles coming to the United States and integrate with regional defenses and our homeland defenses. And fourth, our bill focuses on more testing for missile defense. As I mentioned, the decline of the testing has inhibited the development of these systems. It focuses on the testing, but also doing the testing with our allies, who are also advancing missile defense in different areas of the world. Now, Madam President, as I mentioned, we worked on this bill for months. And one of the key elements that I'm most proud of this bill is the strong bipartisan support that it's gotten in the Senate and in the House. Importantly, when we introduced it as part of the NDAA markup, we had over 1/4 of all the members of the U.S. Senate who were already co-sponsors. Democrats, Republicans from literally every region of the United States. And this is a first and important development in a long time with regard to missile defense. Unfortunately, for years, that's been viewed as a partisan issue, not a bipartisan issue. And what we were trying to do as we developed this bill was to say this shouldn't be partisan. This is a threat that every city in America is going to have to deal with. Let's work together and get a bipartisan bill together. I was proud when the Wall Street Journal editorial board wrote about this bill and emphasized that bipartisan nature. A few months ago, they wrote, "The Advancing America's Missile Defense Act has united conservatives, such as Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, and liberal Democrats, such as Gary Peters and Brian Schatz. No small feat in the Trump era. Mr. Sullivan's Missile Defense Amendment would be a down payment on a safer America in an ever more dangerous world." Why did they write this? Because they understand the importance of having bipartisan support for missile defense, but also the importance of making sure that Congress leads on this important issue. And thankfully, that's what the NDAA does this year, in both versions, the Senate version and the House version. The vast majority of our bill that we introduce, we debated in the markup for the NDAA this year. And again, I want to thank Senators McCain and Reid and other members of the committee on the way in which the broader NDAA came together. But we debated this bill, and the vast, vast majority of our bill on advancing America's missile defense is now in this NDAA. One of the many reasons why I'm encouraging all my colleagues in the Senate to vote to pass it. Madam President, something else that I think is important for my constituents to know, but for all Americans to know, is the role that Alaska plays in America's missile defense. Now, for those of my colleagues who sit on the Armed Services Committee, they've heard me say this many, many times, but there's a famous quote in congressional testimony back in the 1930s by the father of the Air Force, General Billy Mitchell. And his quote in front of Congress was, Alaska is the most strategic place in the world because of its location on the top of the world. Whoever owns Alaska literally controls the world. Fortunately, the United States owns Alaska. So we are, because of that strategic location, the cornerstone of our nation's missile defense. If there was a missile launch from North Korea or Iran or anywhere else in the world, the trajectory would take it over Alaska. It would be tracked by radars in Alaska. It would be shot down by missiles based in Alaska. The 49th Missile Defense Battalion, located at Fort Greely, Alaska, is an Alaska National Guard unit that have a fantastic motto: the 300 protecting the 300 million. Young men and women serving in the Guard on duty 24/7, protecting the entire country. 300 of them protecting the entire United States. That is a worthy mission that we are glad is done so well by the members of the Alaska National Guard. So, Madam President, this bill does a lot. The NDAA, this year that we're debating, finally takes seriously this important mission of missile defense. And as I've noted, it does a lot to advance it. We have a couple additional amendments that we're working on. Hopefully are going to get passed out of the manager's package that would make even more advances to missile defense. We're going to continue to work those. Hopefully we'll continue to have the bipartisan support that we did when this bill was marked up. I remain hopeful that we are finally starting to reverse the trend in missile defense that, as I noted earlier, was one of high ambition followed by increasing modesty. Today we need ambition and we need action. The threat warrants it. The American people demand it. The Congress must step up and deliver it. And that's what's happening in this NDAA, along with many other important, critical provisions for our nation's military. And I encourage all of my colleagues to vote in favor of passage of this important bill.